Night shift smelled of lemon cleaner and old coffee. The school corridor hummed like a held breath. Fluorescent lights flickered in the science wing, and the janitor cart squeaked against tile when Marcus pushed it, fingers raw from soap and time. Then, faint and precise, a melody threaded through the quiet, a string of notes that did not belong to lockers or announcements. He set the mop down and listened, heartbeat tightening until the sound became a question. He walked toward the band room and found a small pair of hands hovering over a worn keyboard, moving with a certainty that surprised him. Noah sat there, eyes downcast, palms feeling the keys as if they were braille. He did not look up. Marcus touched the edge of the bench and asked, "Can I?" Noah nodded with the tip of his jaw and turned the music toward him with a smile he kept for only when he thought no one watched. The two sat together, one hand rough from work and one small and patient, and the hallway shrank to nothing but vibration and a promise. But from the half door, the principal looked through the glass and noted the rule book she kept in her head. That silence outside the room carried a weight that would soon become louder than any note. What would a man who spent nights cleaning classrooms do when the past he tried to bury returned as a melody that could not be ignored? Marcus had been a different man once. He learned piano at 8 on a hand-me-down keyboard in a neighbor's living room, practiced with a metronome taped to a shoebox, and for a few bright years he thought music would take him somewhere other than the night shifts he would come to know. He lost that life slowly. His wife left when Noah was 2, and then she did not return, a small suitcase and a final note that hurt like a closed door. Marcus took the child and the bills and the promise he made to himself to keep the kid in school no matter how tired. He traded recitals for overtime, a rhythm of laundry and lunchboxes that never let him play for an audience. The bracelet he wore on his wrist was made by Noah on a kindergarten afternoon, beads spelling out NOAH in uneven plastic. He wore it like a secret tether to a life where his hands had been allowed to shape sound instead of only clean desks. In the evenings, Marcus would stand by the bedroom door and hum a fragment of Chopin under his breath so the boy would sleep. He told himself the world had no room for an unemployed pianist with a child and a sky full of unpaid tickets. He told himself that was his sacrifice. That story lived in the small fold of a photograph in his wallet, a moment before everything that mattered turned to work. The photograph would become evidence later, a small object linking the man who cleaned and the hands that could make melody. The first real meeting was clumsy and long and full of questions. The band room smelled of piano polish, warm corduroy, and the faint dust of pages turned 1,000 times. Marcus sat at the second keyboard and said, "I used to play when I was younger. Would you mind if I listened?" Noah answered with a slow, steady rhythm he tapped into the bench. Marcus said, "Your rhythm is strong." Noah tapped a pause, and then a phrase that sounded like a question. Marcus tapped back. Their conversation was made of rests and crescendos. "How do you hear it?" Marcus asked once, in a soft voice that felt like a confession. Noah lifted a shoulder and touched the front of his neck where a small sound processor sat, its casing scuffed from years on his back. "I feel," he said, as much to himself as to Marcus. "I count. I see it in space." Marcus stroked the keys with a finger, and the sound vibrated up into his fingertips like a memory returning. "Your teacher is Miss Reyes," Marcus said, naming the voice he had overheard for weeks. Noah smiled and pulled a folded paper from his backpack, fingers fumbling with a zipper. He handed it to Marcus. The paper had notes on it, music that seemed both simple and perfectly formed. On the corner, someone had written, "Accepted." Marcus read the single word and felt the floor slide. He looked up and for the first time saw the small white device on the boy's ear shine under the light like a secret. The room smelled suddenly like future and fear. They met more after that. Miss Reyes arrived with a satchel of sheets and patience. There were evenings of instruction that felt like contraband, the two of them bending rules around the clock. The band room lights were low and the chairs lined up like witnesses. Marcus learned to show Noah how to set tempo with a heel tap and how to press fuller keys to make a tone for the boy to feel. He taught by touch, by placing Noah's hands against his own and letting vibration become lesson. The school corridor outside tasted of bleach and rain. The paint on lockers overheated by summer. The echo of shoes became a metronome. Miss Reyes used the music stand lamp to create islands of warmth. And Lee, the custodian who worked days, would wink from the doorway and say, "You two are breaking the rules, but not the heart." Conversations between Marcus and Miss Reyes stretched late into the night and took the form of instruction and confession. "He composes," she said, handing Marcus a stack of scraps where Noah had drawn melody lines in pencil. "He translates sound into shape." Marcus said, "I never thought he could." She said, "You gave him rhythm." Marcus would then say, "You gave him a chance." Miss Reyes taught Noah to notate with a crayon pressed into cardboard, to feel, phrase, and rest, and the way a small silence could make a later note mean everything. Days passed as a montage of little victories. Noah holding a steady beat for a full page. Noah writing a melody that made Marcus cry in the supply closet. Marcus humming to himself on the bus home. The backpack, always heavy with homework and forgotten granola bars, began to carry something else, pages of composition smudged with the boy's small fingerprints. Insert here a word to you, the viewer, because this part matters, and because many of you are watching thinking, what would I have done? If this scene moved you, know you are not alone. Tell us in the comments who believed in you when everyone else turned away. Start your comment with, "That person was," and share a few words. Your stories remind others that small acts change futures, and they help us find new ideas for the next video. Now, back to the story, to see how a small note would crack an entire system and force choices that none of them were prepared to make. The discovery was loud and administrative. One afternoon, Carlos from HR called Marcus into the office with a clipboard and a look that meant trouble. The note found in Noah's backpack was a form signed by Miss Reyes nominating Noah for a city summer ensemble and a grant attached. But someone in the office had flagged that Marcus had been unsupervised in the building after hours. Principal Susan read the policy before she read the music. "Regulations are regulations," she said. "You cannot be in classrooms with students after hours." Marcus tried to explain, hands moving the way they always had, small and earnest. "He needs you," Marcus said. "I was keeping him safe." Carlos said, "Safety is about paperwork, no exceptions." The accusation landed like a strike. Miss Reyes was called into a meeting. Her eyes, usually soft, hardened with a fear Marcus had not seen. She said, "I hid his rehearsals because I thought it was better than nothing." Principal Susan said, "You circumvented protocol, and now we will have to take action." The council took brief testimony and produced a consequence. Marcus would be relieved of night duties pending review. Miss Reyes would receive a formal reprimand. That moment felt like a physical removal. Marcus left the building under a rain that sounded like applause gone wrong. Noah clutching his backpack, unaware of the widening distance. The fall that followed was a low weather. Marcus found work sweeping at a storage facility, where the air tasted of cardboard and the lights stayed on all night without mercy. He missed the particular smell of the school and the soft warble of Noah practicing scales. He woke at odd hours with a compulsion to return to keys he could not touch in the daylight. He listened to voicemail messages from Miss Reyes like litmus tests for a future that might open. Lena, from the apartment below, knocked and brought soup. She had watched them come and go and knew the look Marcus had when he tried to hold the world together. "You are not just a cleaner," she said, pressing a hand to his arm. "You are his father." He heard the words and felt both the weight of truth and the sting of shame that he had let himself be invisible. Financial worry and pride tangled like Christmas lights. He paced the tiny living room where Noah slept, watching the bracelet on his wrist and replaying the ways his sacrifice had become a quiet erasure. He called Dr. Harris, the audiologist, and set up an appointment because somewhere between being dismissed and being useful, there had to be permission to hope. The confrontation that followed weeks later unfolded in a sterile conference room with a table that swallowed papers. A small crowd gathered. Miss Reyes with a stack of compositions, Principal Susan with policy documents, Carlos with his clipboard, Dr. Harris with a report that said Noah's ability to process rhythm and vibration was exceptional for his level of hearing. Marcus sat with the bracelet on his wrist and the photograph in his pocket. "Why did you hide this from me?" Susan demanded of Miss Reyes. "I did not," Miss Reyes said, her voice steady now. "I tried to protect him from being labeled and removed. I thought it would be easier to teach first, then ask permission." Marcus said, "I am his parent. I would have signed anything to give him a chance." Carlos said, "Policy is clear." Dr. Harris pushed a paper forward. "This is not just talent," he said. "This is a rare sensitivity. He deserves assessment and placement." Mateo, a musician from the community program who had reviewed Noah's recordings, spoke up. "I have heard children, and then I have heard Noah. He deserves a stage, not a bureaucratic obstacle." The room hummed. Words traded like scales. Susan studied the faces and the forms and then, very slowly, made a decision that sounded like an apology and a repair. "We will create an approved program," she said. "Miss Reyes will lead it. Marcus will be rehired as program assistant. We will partner with the city ensemble and Dr. Harris to get Noah proper placement." The sound in the room shifted from accusation to possibility. Marcus felt a reconciliation that had nothing to do with rules and everything to do with people remembering how to care. Public reparation came with a small ceremony in the school auditorium, lights that felt too bright for a man used to fluorescence. The founder of the City Youth Ensemble, a woman named Elena, signed paperwork and placed a certificate in Noah's hands. Parents and teachers, Lena from the apartment complex, Mateo the musician, Carlos looking a little less stiff, and a crowd of students clapped when Marcus was asked to say a few words. He cleared his throat, the microphone cold against his palm. "I am a man who cleaned floors and thought that was enough," he told them. "But my son taught me that listening is a kind of seeing, and that music can give voice where there is no sound." The audience reacted with a warmth that felt like a small tide. The school announced a new inclusion program for children with hearing differences, supported by a modest grant and a commitment to adapt spaces. Miss Reyes was promoted to coordinator, and Marcus was given a title that felt improbable and true: night program assistant in the listing, but father in the only role that mattered. The community named 3 people aloud who had helped Noah, and each time a face stood up to wave, the boy watched and clapped like someone discovering applause for the first time. A year after the note tucked into the backpack changed the course of their nights, Noah stood on a small stage at the City Youth Hall with a keyboard under lights and a ripple of audience before him. He wore the bracelet Marcus had never taken off. Marcus sat in the front row, hands jammed into pockets to stop from clapping early, eyes wet and steady. The room smelled of polish and coffee and the same cheap curtains that had framed so many anonymous recitals. Noah introduced his piece in a whisper that the microphone barely caught. He played with hands both certain and gentle, the melody rising in a line that felt like the contour of both their lives. The audience listened as if learning to breathe with one another. When the final note dissolved, the room exhaled with an applause that had weight and kindness. Principal Susan stood and joined the standing ovation. Miss Reyes wiped her face with a tissue. Dr. Harris looked as if he had been right all along. Lena laughed and clapped until her palms stung. The founder, Elena, hugged Marcus and said, "You kept showing up."
The city program offered Noah a small scholarship and a public spot in the youth ensemble that would tour schools and hospitals, bringing the sound he felt into rooms that needed it. Months later, Marcus walked the corridor once more with a mop, but now students waved and teachers said his name with recognition. The bracelet was a small thing, threaded and bright, but it had become a symbol people knew. Noah rehearsed, in rooms adapted so vibration could be felt in the floor and seats, a practical change that meant access. The school displayed the original folded note in a glass frame near the entrance, not as a trophy, but as proof that small acts and overlooked people can blossom into system change. The last line of this story is simple and true. Music returned more than notes. It returned a father.
Hope, a community's willingness to bend its rules, and a boy's place in a world that once assumed he could not speak. If you believe that small choices still have power, consider subscribing to hear more stories like this and to join a community that keeps watching for the quiet melodies that change lives.